Hi there, and welcome to Axelbank Reports History and Today. Conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. I'm Evan Axelbank, and today we're going to speak with Kate Andersen Brower, the author of The Residence, Inside the Private World of the White House. She's written 4 books about the American presidency and reached #1 on the New York Times bestseller list. She was the first guest on our show back in June of last year, and now she is our first repeat guest. That's because she is the best in the business of explaining the presidency and life in the White House. Kate, welcome back.
Evan, thanks for having me.
Before we start our interview, I do want to invite listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping the show going. Go to patreon.com/AxelbankHistory. We're going to donate part of your contributions to a charity for children's literacy. In The Residence, Kate has done an unbelievable work of history, interviewing staff members who make the house a home, who cook the meals, who bring the drinks, who do the president's laundry, who arrange the flowers, who keep an eye out for anything out of place. I'm out of breath from all that they're doing. Just imagine them. And remember, these are people who don't leave when the administration does. So their view of history is much more permanent than those who live there for 4 or 8 years. You write, Kate, that America's first families are largely unknowable. Their privacy is guarded by a team of roughly 100 people who stay out of sight. What made you want to tell their story?
Well, so I was a reporter at Bloomberg News, and I was covering the Obama administration, and there was a very specific lunch with Michelle Obama where she hosted about a dozen mostly female reporters who cover the East Wing, and this person came in, served us this elegant, lunch on China, and I was not used to this because in the White House, as reporters, you work in the basement and you eat out of brown paper bags if you eat lunch at all. So
no glamour.
No glamour there. And so he came in and served us, and she had this rapport with him and called him by his name and thanked him. And I just wondered who these people were, right? It's like we never got to see them. And it coincided with a time when I was about to have our first child, and I was thinking about how would I ever keep up this schedule that was just really, I wouldn't see our son very much. It would just be so difficult. And so I ended up pitching this book idea to a book agent here in DC, who I knew through my husband, and I didn't know him well at all. And he said, listen, go out and try to talk to as many residents, staff as you can, as many former, because current staff don't talk really, although I've talked to a couple of them now, but off the record. But so I put together a proposal that was about 30 pages long, and it was just interviews strung together. And as a reporter, it's when you get that one really great source. So I found this woman named Christine Limerick, who was the head housekeeper for decades, and she was wonderful. And I went to her house in Delaware, and we had coffee, and we talked, and she shared these great stories. And it's like I knew then that there was a book here, because it's like a world that we don't get to see. It's this hidden world in the most public house.
Well, let's go on that journey today then. The White House is not only where the president works, but where the family lives. Of course, Barack Obama called it living above the store. Why is the richness of the history in their home just as important to America as the history that happens in the Oval Office?
Well, I mean, the fact that, they have, someone described it to me as, living in a very fancy New York apartment, like over Park Avenue, that there's this sense of privacy that they have on the 2nd and 3rd floors. I was fascinated with, because it's a working house where you have thousands of people coming in for tours of the state floor. You have hundreds of reporters in the West Wing, in the briefing room, and the Oval Office, and these very public spaces. But you do have this hidden world that is private. I mean, you don't get up to the residence. As a reporter, it's very, very difficult to get invited, and I think that I was just interested in kind of the Downton Abbey aspect of this too, like the upstairs, downstairs, like the world of the staff. I mean, there are 2 underground basement floors where the butlers have lockers where they keep their uniforms, their tuxedos, and there are cubicles where the painters work, where the florists work, and all that. And I think and the thing that's the most interesting about it to me is like what they see of the president and the first lady. You know?
So describe on a daily basis, once the president, I guess, wakes up, or are they working before that? If you can just describe how they help a president and first family get through their day.
Yeah, I mean, so there are about 100 resident staff, but there are half a dozen butlers who work on the second floor. And the butlers are the people who see everything. And then there are 2 or 3 valets who work in like a rotation, and they work for the military. They work for the Navy, so they're not technically resident staff. But they all work in shifts, and it depends on the president. I mean, Lyndon Johnson had such a chaotic schedule that there were so many shifts built in because he would, nap in the afternoon and wake up and start like a whole second day at 10 at night,
I could see that.
Yeah, he was really difficult to work for. But then someone like George W. Bush was a really easy president to work for because he had this regimented schedule.
But so do they go in and nudge the guy awake? Or and have an orange juice sitting there with them and toast, or how does that work?
They call there's like a wake up call from the White House operators, and then it's such an elaborate system. I mean, there's an usher's office, and they have a setup where there's a chief usher who's like the general manager of the White House. He runs everything. The guy there now, Timothy Harleth, was hired by the Trumps. He works for Trump Hotels. And I keep wondering what he's doing now because he's in charge of the moving out and the moving in, and it's the staff who does it. So I've asked the Biden a Biden spokesman if they've heard from Timothy, and he said, no, not yet. This was as of yesterday. But they need to know, there needs to be coordination between the incoming president and the chief usher. And the fact that that hasn't happened is a little bit disconcerting.
Well, we're taping this in late November, so we'll see what happens over the next couple of months. This is going to be released in the week before the inauguration. So perhaps things by then will be clear. So we're speaking to you from the past, but in just over a week. So when the episode is released, now I can say in just over a week, the residence is going to undergo a huge transformation. Protocol, at least, calls for the Trumps to move out and the Bidens to move in. And during that morning of January 20th and early afternoon, the White House staff is going to be very hard at work, very, very hard at work. So describe what we would see if we could be a fly on the wall in the White House and what the White House staffers, permanent ones, would be doing that morning and early afternoon.
So there's literally a moving truck that comes on the South Lawn driveway and brings the departing president and first lady's things out to wherever they're going, and the new president and first lady's things in. It's actually, one comes in the front and one comes in the back. So it's a really interesting thing because it shows the outgoing and the incoming from 2 different sides of the White House. And it is the White House chief usher's job to make sure this is done seamlessly. And some other administrations, you don't want to make it seem like you're kicking the president and the first lady out. So they'll put their furniture, the Bushes, for instance, George W. Bush and Laura Bush had some of their furniture, I believe it was in the China room, ready to be taken out so that it would be more seamless when the Obamas moved in. So you can do it that way. But you would see that day, normally on Inauguration Day, everyone's eyes are trained on the Capitol, on the swearing in. But at the White House, it's like this beehive of activity. So because of security clearances and just the nature of this being the most like a fortress-like house, right? That they only have the resident staff doing the move. So you'll have cooks moving furniture. You'll have
all hands on deck.
Yeah, it's an all hands on deck situation. One engineer told me he threw his back out moving a sofa. I mean, it's just chaos. And so when the new
So they're
campaign.
bringing in the new furniture. They're taking out the old furniture. The Bidens will say, "We want this in there, and we want
Yep.
these clothes in there, and everything else."
Yeah. And so that when the idea is that when they come in, before the inaugural balls, when they come in to get ready, that they'll have their toothbrushes on the bathroom counter. Everything will be perfectly laid out for them. And there's usually they will have an interior decorator come in and look around and sort of plan with the chief usher what changes they might want to make in that period between November and January. Obviously, that's going to be different this time around.
So, do we have any sense, based on your reporting, of what the protocol is going to be among the staff members, what they're going to have to be ready for when it comes to the Trump-Biden transition?
Baking from our childhoods just sticks in the memory, doesn't it? We never set off on holiday without piles of Tupperware. And there'd always be Bakewell slice, flapjacks, and tray baked scones in the boot.
Do you not do that, Lisa?
Yeah, no. Sadly, I do not stack the Tupperware in the back of the car when we go off on holiday.
Oh.
Welcome to Small Ways to Live Well, a new podcast from the Simple Things magazine. Season 2 is a pick-me-up tonic that helps us make the shift from winter to spring. A 6-week suggestion box full of things to note, notice and enjoy about the season. Search for Small Ways to Live Well on your podcast app.
Well, we know that the Bidens are a known quantity, which is something like they really like that. They know what they know what they like. They know what they don't like. There's always this big concern that, like, what will they want for breakfast, for instance? Like the executive pastry chef told me that when the Clintons came in, like, he had H&H bagels flown in from New York. He heard that they liked bagels.
I would do that. I would do that. Yeah.
Yeah. And like so they hear rumors of what, foods they like and what shampoo they like and all of that. And so with the Bidens, because they've been there before, I mean, he was VP, he lived in the observatory, right? But they know a bit of what they're about. And I think that will make it easier for them. But, it's still going to be tricky, but you have to think back to 2000, right? There wasn't a lot of time in that, so.
This is a bit off the beaten path, but would a VP be allowed to ask for something? In other words, when Joe Biden was serving Barack Obama or Mike Pence now, can they in the White House say, "Hey, can you get me a Coke?" Or can you?
Oh, yeah.
They're big enough deal where they okay.
Yes.
So they know these guys.
But the VP has the best setup because they live in the Naval Observatory, which is about a mile outside, beyond the White House in Northwest DC. And it's this beautiful Victorian house with a huge veranda. And I remember going to a party there where the Biden gave, he does this party when he was VP for reporters. And he would do this huge party in the backyard and run around with water guns, and like it was and you could bring your kids. It was like a carnival type atmosphere.
You saw Biden with a water gun.
Oh yeah, there's great images of that.
Grandkids and everything. So.
Yeah. It was just it was really fun and open, and I think there's a hope that there might be a return to a little bit of a better relationship with the media.
You described the incredible moment that one resident staffer witnessed the night after President Obama was inaugurated, or I guess the night that President Obama was inaugurated. He was, the staffer you talk about was dropping off papers and found himself face to face with Barack and Michelle Obama, who were playing music.
Yeah, I mean, it's this very intimate moment where they're there. They've worked so hard to get. Every president has worked so hard, and First Lady, to get to this point. And he was dropping off this usher was dropping off papers to the president, and it was the Obama's first night in the residence, and they were dancing to, I think it was a Mary J. Blige song, and they were in there like I think it might have been that they were in their sweatpants. I can't remember that they had come back from the inaugural balls, but I have it in the book, the details of it. And it's just like this look at them finally being able to like exhale and celebrate, after, mean, campaigns, as you know, they take a lot out of people, and it's a year plus. And the chief usher of the White House, it's really interesting. I interviewed Gary Walters, who has helped a bit with the Trump administration, and he was chief usher during the Bushes, and I believe the first Bushes, and I believe the Clintons. And he said that, he would start planning a year out. Like, he would be looking at the primaries, trying to figure out what these people like, what they don't like, all that. It's just like it's hard to, you were asking what a normal day is like, and it's just very hard to describe, because it truly depends on the president, and it depends on the schedule, but it's a big, the machinery of the White House is more intricate than a lot of people think.
One of the things that Barack Obama had said to the usher was, they were listening to Mary J. Blige, Real Love. It's a great song. And he said to the usher, I guess you haven't seen a lot of this sort of thing around here. I guess alluding to the fact that there was a president with a different kind of background, a different kind of family background, and different tastes in music. And a lot of these ushers are African American. Must have been a striking moment for them.
Yeah, I mean, this particular usher was white, but a lot of the butlers are African American, and they had tears in their eyes when the Obamas moved in. A couple of them told me they never thought they would see this day. It was very moving for them. The first Black president, first Black first lady, the Sasha and Malia reminded them of their own grandkids, because a lot of them are older too. And so it was really emotional. And, these are some of the staff. Some of the part-time butlers who I've interviewed are in their 70s and 80s, and they remember segregation. It's just amazing. And so here they are at a time when, their parents couldn't sit in, wherever they wanted to in the bus in DC, but here they are working for the first Black president and first lady. So it was very moving.
There are a couple of other fascinating moments involving the Obamas that you talk about. The first is the outgoing daughters of George W. Bush invited Malia and Sasha to give them a tour of the White House residence before they moved in. And then once they were in, the Obamas went out of their way to make sure that their daughters knew that the people who were waiting on mom and dad were not there to wait on the two daughters. How did the resident staff react to that?
They still did whatever the daughters wanted.
How could you say no to a kid, right?
Yeah, someone, one of the florists told me he made a little Christmas tree with lights on it for each of the girls, and they wrote thank you notes. One of the butlers who passed away was from Haiti, and he was spoke French, and Michelle Obama had him tutor the girls in French, and the florist would describe all the different kinds of flowers and the arrangements, because Michelle wanted her daughters to learn about flowers in a way she never had before. They try to take advantage of living in this incredible life. And Michelle Obama, as we know, came from the South Side of Chicago, very middle class, very working class upbringing. And so this was a whole new world for her. I do think it was harder for them to adjust, like it was hard for the Clintons to adjust, because they didn't have that upbringing that the Bushes did, where the Bushes were used to having staff. So they kind of made that transfer more easily. I think if you come from a middle class background, like most people, it's kind of weird to never be alone. The sense that there's always somebody standing there waiting to serve you.
You're sort of waiting. It's sort of like living at a hotel, but the people who make up the rooms are also willing to bring you drinks and do your laundry and all these other things, I guess.
Yes.
The White House has been renovated several times, both under Truman and then redecorated by Jackie Kennedy. And I think the Clintons also did a pretty big redecoration. You have a number of stories in your book about one particular staffer's relationship with President Kennedy, Bruce. And the reason I'm talking about this sort of public-private life that the president and his wife are now living is because Bruce used to find sort of these late night hijinks between Jack and Jackie, where Jackie would kind of have to wink at him going when she would go by in the hallway. So I don't know if you want to talk about that, but it was it was a moment that most of us may not realize was happening.
Yeah, I mean, it's very sweet, right? That they, especially towards the end of their marriage, which is very particularly sad. The Kennedys were very, very close after Patrick, their son, died. And there was a scene where, they slept in separate bedrooms, but she was going to Jack's room, and Preston Bruce saw her in the hallway, and she winked at him and said, you're married too. So, she was kind of like sneaking around, and it was very cute. I do think it was important to know that she, wanted her kids to always respect the staff too. And she said, we don't call him Bruce, we call him Mr. Bruce. This idea that he was an African-American gentleman, had to be treated with respect. And, Michelle Obama made her daughters make their beds. I mean, to your point that you can't be, I think the added challenge for first ladies, and I've written about first ladies a lot, is a sense that the staff will do anything for those kids. And that's an added burden added pressure to make sure that your kids don't get out of hand. Chelsea did a cooking class with the chef, and she was very grateful and people say Chelsea, I mean, the resident staff loved Chelsea, and they also felt badly for her so it's they feel like there's this paternal instinct that comes out in them of wanting to protect the kids that live there, because it is hard.
There's a wonderful story. It's not from your book. It's from a book called Kennedy and King by Stephen Levingston. But there's a wonderful story where JFK is watching the March on Washington from the roof of the White House with Bruce. And he says, by God, I wish I could be out there with them. I always think about that moment whenever I hear stories about Bruce or Mr. Bruce. Anyway, there is a learning curve.
I had that in my book too.
Did you really? Oh gosh, I'm so sorry.
No,
okay, no, I'm glad you got that in there.
Book. I don't know.
Maybe I did get it from your. Maybe I don't remember now.
I love that. I love that story because that, what that's originally from? That's from Preston Bruce's memoir, and so I encourage people to. There's a great book, if you're interested in the resident staff, there's a great book by J.B. West called Upstairs at the White House, and he was a White House usher. And then Preston Bruce wrote his own book that is something, I have it, it's called My Years at the White House, that you can get on Amazon, but it's really interesting to hear the first person accounts.
Yeah. There's a learning curve when you move into the White House. What's allowed? How does everything work? What can I ask for? What can't I ask for? Is everything free? I know presidents are often surprised that they have to pay for their food, at least not for official functions. But tell us the story about Lucy Baines and the fireplace, and what seems to be the biggest thing that and then I guess what is the biggest thing presidential families have to adjust to once they move in?
I mean, Lucy had a friend over for a sleepover, and she told me how excited she was to have this fireplace in her bedroom. It felt like so extravagant to have a fireplace in your bedroom. And she lit a fire, and it went terribly wrong, and the smoke started billowing up, and she started to panic, what if I'm setting the White House on fire, And it was and her friend was panicking. I mean, this was just supposed to be a fun sleepover. She was a teenager, and they had to get the staff came rushing in and put out the fire, and the maids had to clean up. And Lady Bird Johnson said, they're not doing it alone. You get in there and help them. There was soot on the walls and everything. And that's another example of where they're as First Lady, you're on the front lines, and you have to tell your kids, you gotta take responsibility. And so that was a great story because it just shows, Lucy is amazing because she's got such incredible stories. When Kennedy was killed and her parents were in the motorcade, and she was going to school in DC, and all of a sudden, in her class, the Secret Service takes her out and says there's been a shooting, and she assumes it's her parents, and so the emotional side of that, And I think we get caught up in this moment now where there's just so much drama, and truth is stranger than fiction, but it's been that way throughout history. There have been so many dramatic stories and moments.
Even though the house is surrounded by plenty of police officers, Secret Service, gates, there's from time to time illicit activity that takes place inside, especially when there are teenagers around. You described the resident staff as being aware of things that, especially the teenage presidential kids were doing that wasn't so good, or at least not necessarily legal in the district. For instance, there's been some drinking, some pot smoking. While those things, I suppose, were illegal, what does it say about the job that resident staffers have that they didn't turn them in?
Yeah, and that they knew. I mean, Barbara and Jenna Bush had a party, and they knew that and there was drinking, and illegal drinking, and they knew that no one was going to turn them in on the staff, because they know that they can trust the resident staff above anyone else. And the Carters, they smoked pot in the White House. They went up on the roof and smoked, and I think pot is legal in the district now. It definitely wasn't then.
I think one of them said that there was always a bong to move or something like that.
Yeah, exactly.
Moving a bong, right?
Everything. But these are, they were in their 20s, right? Their early 20s at the time. And Rosalind Carter and, of course, Jimmy Carter, they were really busy. And Rosalind was such an active first lady. I think she was doing so much actual work that she wasn't like a helicopter parent at all.
Right.
So they did what they wanted to. And, I think the challenge comes more with like kids that are Barron Trump's age, when you're really young. And or you're not so young, you're in that middle school kind of period. I think that's the hardest time for kids in general. But
once in a while, there are house guests, very famous and powerful house guests. Maybe one of my favorite stories in any book that I've ever read, frankly, involves Prince Philip wanting to, in the words of one of your sources, just be one of the boys. It starts with, this story at least starts with, "Your Majesty, would you care for a cocktail?"
Yeah, I love that story too, because everyone loves The Crown, right? And you can actually see how this would play out with Prince Philip. He was there. I believe this was in the 70s. The butler was Linwood Westray, who has since passed away, but he was wonderful African-American, and had been working there for years and years. And he was there with his friends, serving the Queen and, Prince Philip. And it was this moment where I think when he told me this story, I couldn't believe it, because he just described offering Prince Philip a drink and Prince Philip saying, "I'll only have one if you'll sit down with me." They were alone. It was very late at night. And I asked what they talked about, and he couldn't remember, unfortunately, or at least that's what he said. I hoped, but, and they sat down and had a drink. Yeah. Wow. Who knows if he remember. I mean, some of them probably went to their graves or will go to their graves with these stories that are just incredible. They really don't want to say anything that makes the president look bad. So, when they would describe what it was like during the Clinton years and the fighting over Lewinsky and all that, I knew that they were even downplaying that it was probably worse than they even said.
Do they ever get over, I mean, you think about if I were president, if I were president, I feel like I would get over asking for stuff all the time. Like, it's tough to keep asking, "Hey, could you get me this?" Or "Could you get me that?" Or, "I hate to ask again." Like, you sort of want to apologize. I mean, I do this even in a random store or restaurant or something like that. Do they ever get used to that part of this? Or do they eventually say, I can't ask him and bother him again or bother her again for something?
I think with the Clintons, especially like Hillary Clinton, when Chelsea was sick, she just went ahead and made her Chelsea had the stomach flew, and she went ahead and made her like toast and eggs or something really bland. And the butlers rather were like, oh my gosh, please stop. What are you doing? This was in the family kitchen upstairs. Like, let us do this for you. Let us get the chefs to make her an omelet. And she said, no, I just want to do this myself, you know. And to your point, like she ended up making, you know, Chelsea her lunch or whatever by herself, because you do get sick of asking. And I think that does make it really stressful. But there is a family kitchen upstairs. They go in if they are home and they don't want anybody to be there. They can say that. The Secret Service will be stationed near the elevator. It's not as though like if they want to go get like a Diet Coke or a glass of wine or something, they have a kitchen.
And that's stocked with stuff.
Yes. So they're not always asking, but like the Bushes, George H.W. Bush and Barbara Bush, like my sense from talking to the staff who worked for them was they liked having, you know, they were just fine like asking for things because that's what they knew. And they were by far the most beloved family to work there because they just like loved the staff.
Interesting. Is the Coke button true? Donald Trump, can he press a button, have a Coke come out?
You know what? I interviewed him in the Oval Office and there was a Coke on the desk, but I don't know.
Don't know how it got there.
I don't know how it got there. He was very, like, the thing about Trump that's so interesting, and I'm just dying to see what happens once he's not in office, but like the staff who work there, really, many of them do like him personally. They think that he treats the staff well. I've been told that he, when they first moved in, offered to give cash tips to people, and they would say like, you know, we can't take a tip, but thank you very much. Like, so he was very, there's one butler in the White House who's been there for decades, and he didn't retire because he liked working for Trump. So it's very personal. It just depends, like their personal dynamic. And this is an African-American butler. And so a lot of people would assume, oh, he must really be a Democrat just like Trump. But it's not about politics. It's about the person.
When they move in, you said that they want to know what the president wants to have for breakfast. How much do they take requests for food and everything else?
Oh, they'll do anything. I mean, Michelle Obama talks about how her husband was on a trip and he really liked this particular dish, and it was a foreign trip, and he had mentioned it to the chef that he really liked this dish, and somehow the White House had, you know, arranged. Christetta Comerford is the chef there. She's amazing, and she arranged to have this dish flown in. And Michelle Obama sees the bill and is like, we don't need this. I don't know how much it was, but it's like, this gets really expensive really fast. Granted, these people are all incredibly wealthy and can afford this. And when they leave the White House, they make lots of money. But it's still, I think there's like a level of just trying to please. And I'm always interested in like that moment of when the president is walking down the hallway, the center hall on the second floor, and you're a florist and you just changed an arrangement. Do you make eye contact with the president? Do you say hello? Like, do you wait for them to say something? In some administrations, like they were like terrified and they would go, you know, clear out the hallway. But I've been told with Trump and with Obama and with Bush, you just let them walk by. If they say hello, you say hello. If they don't say anything, you don't say anything, because they have a lot on their minds.
You have a chapter in the book called Dark Days, speaking of a lot on their minds. The chapter is called Dark Days, and the staff is along for the ride when it comes to things like impeachment or impeachments, because we've had two now in recent memory. Political scandals come up, wars come up. The person they're serving may well be in the middle of moving troops around a battlefield. One thing I want to ask you about is September 11th. What happened on September 11th in the House and in the West Wing that day, in the East Wing? And we know it was evacuated, but just describe whether the resident staff had to leave or stay, or what happened.
So I interviewed Laura Bush about that, and she said, can you imagine what it was like for my staff? You heard these, young women working in the East Wing, and they are told to run and kick off their heels and just go running out of the White House, because that was the way it felt then. The White House was, the center of a bullseye on 9/11. They felt like this was, and the reporting was that the next plane was headed for the White House. So there were, and I didn't know this until I worked on the book, there was a picnic that was a congressional picnic that was going to be later that day. And there were a bunch of picnic tables set up on the South Lawn. And on 9/11, the president's helicopter, so he was in the air, right? He was in Florida. He was circling. Well, the night before 9/11, and I also didn't know this, Barbara Bush and George H.W. Bush had stayed at the White House. So they left that morning. And the president was, of course, in Florida. And eventually he came back to Washington because he thought that was an important, symbolically, he had to come back and address the country. And Marine One, the helicopter, needed to land on the South Lawn, and they needed to make space. And so the staff actually had to, a few of the kind of more muscular, younger guys stayed and moved furniture, these picnic tables that were on the South Lawn for this big event with members of Congress. And they felt like they were racing against the clock, that like at any minute, a plane could come and hit the White House and kill them. I mean, it was just this feeling of total fear that hadn't felt like that since the Cuban Missile Crisis, when, they had the same sense that, and I think we forget about the Cuban, well, it was so long ago, but the Cuban Missile Crisis, and one usher who worked there at the time said, he's never been more scared in his life to go to work. And the staff had PTSD after 9/11, and there were counselors brought in. But Laura Bush told me that like nobody quit, which was amazing. Like she was very impressed.
Were any of the staffers allowed to go into the bunker for safety, or was that solely reserved for the president and vice president?
As far as I know, that was solely reserved for the president and the vice president, but none of the staffers went down there.
Is there a documented case of a president's experience with a staffer impacting national policy? And I'm only asking this because we know that when Lyndon Johnson was a senator, he heard a story from his limo driver who was Black, who had nowhere to stop while he was driving the Senate Majority Leader's limo from Washington to Texas. So of course he had to drive through the South, and he would basically report back and say, Senator, there's nowhere for me to stop. I can't go to the bathroom. I can't get an apple. I can't get into a hotel room. I have to drive this thing straight from here to Texas. And Johnson actually says, he's majority leader at this point, he basically says that's wrong, and this is something that needs to be fixed. So does the connection that presidents inevitably get with someone who they're working with all the time, does that impact their thinking on policy? Has that been documented at all? And I don't mean to put you on the spot on that, but just curious.
It's a good question. I mean, that's the story that does immediately come to mind is the one you just told, but that was also
sorry.
Yeah, no, it's a good one.
Yeah.
You stepped on my line. That's the best story, because like that story also, that was the case with Zephyr Wright, who was the Johnson's family cook, who was Black, and she was very close to the family. And Lady Bird Johnson would tell her husband the same thing, and Zephyr told him the same thing too, that we can't stay. Lady Bird couldn't stay in certain hotels, and Lady Bird, to her credit, would not stay apart from Zephyr. She wouldn't do it. So they would just keep driving, or they would, so that kind of complements what you're saying. That real world experience. I'm sure as soon as we get off this call, I will think of something where, I do think that there is always this sense, though, that like they do still walk on eggshells around the president and the first lady. I don't think that there's, with any president, even George H.W. Bush, who was pretty tight with the staff and would ask how their families were and knew, all their names and everything, a sense that you would go with a complaint. Like there was a story during Vietnam, and Eugene Allen, the movie The Butler was based on this gentleman, and his son told me this great story that rings a bell, where his son Charles was serving in Vietnam, and I believe it was Eugene's wife who said, can't you talk to President Kennedy about like getting him home? This is, they were actually trying to get the president to help in a very specific case. And then Kennedy was killed. And Eugene didn't have that type of relationship with Johnson where he could go to him and ask for help. So I think that, they really try not to ask for favors, ask for help, complain, any of that, because it's not their job, right?
When staffers do look back on their time as being part of the resident staff, do they feel a real sense of appreciation that they helped American history happen?
I think that they are so humble about their jobs that it's just totally refreshing. Like you can go to their houses and see on their walls pictures with every president. James Ramsey, one of my favorite people to interview, was a White House butler, very, very close with the Bush family, also with the Obamas and the Clintons. People just loved him, so much so that when he passed away, Laura Bush flew from Texas to give his eulogy here in DC. So he had this really modest apartment, and on the walls there were pictures of him with like the Pope, and with, just everybody. And I don't think they see themselves that way. I just think they see themselves as doing a service that is important for our democracy, to keep things moving. But I don't think that they see themselves as, I think they feel honored to have the job.
How do they I should have asked this earlier to frame this a little better, but how do they get the job? How do you get a job there? Is there a long line? Is it something you just through monster.com or whatever?
There's definitely no job application, like no Craigslist, there's no way to get this through. This is just like a
Help
job.
wanted.
Yeah, you get this through people That's why so many of them, like there was one family, the Jeffries family, and they, I believe it was 9 members of the family worked at the White House at one point. It is because you need to trust the people that you bring in, right? And there have been people fired for all sorts of things, because you serve at the pleasure of the president. You can be fired for any reason. And like people get fired for, one curator was fired for writing a book. Somehow they found out that this person was writing a book. If you get a DUI, you could be fired. Like things like that are relatively, like in another job, it wouldn't be a fireable offense necessarily. In this job, they are in your life in a way that's really unusual,
So you've got a children's book coming out. Let's talk about the children's book.
Yes, I was trying to see. It's exploring the White House. It is about, it's kind of a combination of the residents and my book called First Women, about the first ladies. It's for 8 to 12-year-olds. That's the market it's aimed at. And really it's about the staff, and it's about the contributions of like a few key first ladies. Jackie Kennedy, Michelle Obama, Laura Bush. I also, it's nonpartisan, it's really just White House history. I've got, for kids, they're really interested in how this stuff works, like, the layout of the White House.
And it's not 3 floors. It looks like it's 3 floors, but it's not.
It's not. It's really 8 floors, because there are 2 sort of partial floors also. And in the book, I have like the layout of the White House and a flow chart of who does what and everything, because it is kind of complicated. At the very top, there's the president and the first lady. Then there's the chief usher, who has 2 assistant ushers who oversee all these different shops. I mean, it's
And so you think kids really kids not only want to learn this stuff, but you think they need to know this stuff, right?
I do. And I mean, I think that it's important for them to get a sense of American history, and I think another thing that the book tries to do is kind of the layers of history that have happened in this house. And you're such a history buff. Like, Willie Lincoln was passed away in the White House, and I believe it was in the Green Room, his body was laid out. I mean, it is just so much has happened in this one place, and I think that kids are fascinated. It's the closest thing we have to Buckingham Palace. We have nothing like this, and it's the closest thing we have to the royal family, right? Is the president and the first lady, and people are always fascinated by that, and like, what's it like to live there? And I do think the minute detail. I think that kids. That's what I've learned having kids myself too. It's like they really want to know the details of, like, okay, if you're a florist, like where's the flower shop? Is that, when you're looking at the White House, can you see it? Is it underground? I mean, they like to know that stuff. So that's what this book tries to do.
Kate Andersen Brower, author of The Residence, Inside the Private World of the White House. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Evan.
Check out that book and her Twitter profile, which is @KateBrower. Her website is katebrower.com. I also want to invite listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping the show going. Go to patreon.com/AxelBankHistory. Part of your contributions go to a charity for children's literacy. And thank you for listening to Axel Bank Reports, History, and Today. Conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. Be sure to check us out on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram @AxelBankHistory. We update those with clips from the show, guest announcements, and book recommendations. We'll see you next time. Thanks.